And in order to pursue that political aim, he built a structure of a legal structure which basically created very significant interest groups. So, for example, he transferred a lot of money to the unions, he generated a very protective society, he generated special regimes of protection for certain industries. And the problem is that when you create those rents tend to persist over time, correct? And then the rents that are transferred to those groups are used afterwards to buy the wills to preserve the system, okay? And so Argentina built this architecture, this status quo society in the late 1960s, and which the President Milei calls this the caste system, el sistema de las castas. And Milei adds an adjective to that. He says it's not el sistema de las castas, it's el sistema empobrecedor de las castas. It's the impoverishing model of the caste. And I think that's very appropriate because I mentioned when this system was implemented in the late 1960s, Argentina was a country which was richer than Spain. It stopped growing. Our income since then has been 0.5% per year per capita growth. It's one of the worst performance in the world since then. But in the late 1960s, we had a 5% poverty rate. And when Milei took over his presidency, the poverty rate was above 50%. So that's why Milei says this is the impoverishing model of the caste. So, and I think Milei is the first real and effective challenge to this system in 50 years. And therefore, the first real possibility of a significant change. Milei has one idea, which is that something is going to change in Argentina, and what's going to change is that Argentina is going to have a fiscal surplus. Period. No condition is nothing. Fiscal surplus, always. With a twist, because he says we're going to achieve that fiscal surplus not through an increase in taxes, but through a reduction in government expenditures. We tend to think that what most of the things government does are useless, so you better reduce government expenditure rather than collect more taxes to finance that expenditure. That's the chainsaw. The chainsaw is the reduction in government expenditure. In the first year, we have chainsaw 1.0 and we have chainsaw 2.0. So let me start with chainsaw 1.0, which is what we did in the first year. In the first year, he reduced government expenditure 30%. He closed the budget deficit of 5% of GDP in his first month. Okay, people thought that was impossible, including here, your servant. But I asked the finance minister, how did you achieve this? And he said, well, each time I went to see Javier and I suggested something, Javier said, oh, this is great, but do it twice as big, okay? So that certainly helped. And so he reduced government expenditure 30%. It was a reduction of government expenditure by 5%. And I think there are three reflections that I think I would like to share here, which I think interesting. I don't know how much each one of these things I'm going to say translate to other countries, but you'll see what it is and you can make up your own mind. The first thing is about the size and speed with which you can do a fiscal adjustment. I talked to political candidates in other countries which call me to see what's going on with Milei, and they say, oh, I have a fiscal deficit of 4%, maybe I can reduce 1% per year, so I end my term with a fiscal balance. I say, oh, 1% per year, why don't you do 5% in 1 month? And they say, no, that's impossible. Well, but that's what Milei did. And that forces you to think a little bit out of the box. Milei touched things which I thought were untouchable, and he said, no, we're going to get rid of this, and we got rid of them, and not only nothing happened, but we achieved this fiscal surplus very quickly. So I think he has reframed the discussion on what has to be done. Maybe we were just not creative enough, we were not rebellious enough, we were not bold enough in thinking about what could be done and what could not be done. The second thing is that there's a little bit of something that probably everybody would have thought, that if you do a 5% fiscal adjustment, you maybe are going to take a hit on the economy. The economy is going to suffer. Well, we didn't think that was going to be the case at all. In fact, there was a famous professor here at the Harvard Econ Department, Alberto Alesina, who had worked on this, looking at fiscal stabilizations in Europe, and he found that fiscal adjustments which were implemented through a reduction in government expenditure tended to be expansionary from an economic point of view. Why? Because if you reduce government expenditure, you reduce taxes, because everything that the government spends, someone has to pay for it. I mean, the money doesn't come up from out of thin air. So if you reduce government expenditure, you reduce taxes. And if you may have a negative output effect of the reduction in the government expenditure, you definitely have an expansionary output effect from the reduction in taxes, because when you reduce taxes, people have a larger disposable income and they spend more. So you have a phenomenon of crowding in of private consumption. So he reduced government expenditure 5%. What happened to the economy? The economy grew 6%. Not only did not fall, it grew 6%. So there was an increase in the spending for the private sector of 11 points, correct? 5 plus 6. But what was the most important? How did this happen? This happened because by reducing expenditure, he reduced the inflation tax. This was the most important tax that he reduced. And he reducing the inflation tax, he reduced the tax on the poor, mostly. And by doing this reduction in government expenditure, this chainsaw, and reducing the inflation tax, he got 10 million Argentines out of poverty. The poverty rate fell by 20 points. Okay, so there was no. So I think we have to revisit that idea that a fiscal adjustment is going to be costly in terms of output. I think it's wrong. I think the theory doesn't say that that's what's going to happen, and I think this is an example, quite dramatic example, where that didn't happen. And the third, which actually ties with this last thing I was saying, is people said, well, if you do a fiscal adjustment of 5% of GDP, it's going to cost you, maybe it doesn't cost you in output, but it's going to cost you in popularity, okay? That's also tremendously wrong. Because if you cut the expenditure which people perceive as corruption, which you perceive as useless, people were paying for something, they were getting nothing in exchange for that. So you actually said, someone which gets the, I think the expression, el toro por las astas, someone gets the bull by its horns, correct? And finally has decided that it's going to reduce this. So, and imagine, if in addition to that, you take 10 million people out of poverty, how can that be an unpopular move? So I think that the chainsaw has been dramatic in its implementation, and it has been surprising in its effect, at least surprising, perhaps not for us, because we did it because we believe this is what's going to happen, but certainly surprising for conventional wisdom, okay? Just a small word and we finish with chainsaw. Now we move to chainsaw 2.0, okay? So what is chainsaw 2? Because we did this 30% adjustment, and then President Milei got us in the cabinet and said, guys, now start, okay, doing the correction of the fiscal. And so I said, well, we need a framework. So we spent a whole cabinet meeting doing the exercise of deciding what should a libertarian government do. So we made a list of the yes, and we did a list of the no's. So now my chainsaw men and women are going around the government and say, oh, what do you do? Are you in the yes or in the no's? If you're in the yes, fine, and if you're in the no's, you go, correct? So every peso we save with a chainsaw is 1 peso less of taxes that we're going to charge people. And this is the fundamental reason why we do it. We want a smaller state, a cheaper state, and we want more of the GDP to be spent by people freely, and not having people pay the state something, taxes, so that the state decides how the money is going to, their money is going to be spent. So we believe that the best way for people to spend their money is that they spend them themselves, and this is why we believe in a smaller state.